The story of the lost colony of Roanoke has endured for more than 4 centuries, lingering like a haunting echo across the windswept shores of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It is a tale that begins with ambition, empire, and hope, but dissolves into silence, mystery, and speculation. Few stories in American history have captivated the imagination so profoundly, and fewer still remain as tantalizingly unresolved. To understand the riddle of Roanoke, one must begin with the world of the late 16th century, an age when England was emerging as a maritime power, eager to challenge Spain and stake its claim in the New World. The vision of empire was one of riches, trade routes, and new opportunities, but it was also one of faith and survival. Sir Walter Raleigh, an ambitious courtier favored by Queen Elizabeth I, received a charter in 1584 to establish a colony in North America. His dream was to plant an English foothold that could act as both a base for privateers attacking Spanish ships and as the seed of a broader colonial enterprise. Raleigh himself never set foot on the land that would become famous for its mystery, but he invested heavily in the voyages that would try to bring that dream to life. The first expedition of 1584, led by Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, returned with glowing reports of fertile lands, friendly indigenous people, and seemingly boundless potential. 2 Native Americans, Manteo and Wanchese, even traveled back to England, fascinating the court and providing valuable information about the region. Inspired by these accounts, Raleigh organized further expeditions. In 1585, he dispatched a military outpost led by Sir Richard Grenville, who left behind a garrison of men under the command of Ralph Lane on Roanoke Island. Yet, the experience proved harsher than expected. Relations with the local Algonquian tribe soured, supplies ran short, and morale weakened. When Sir Francis Drake appeared in 1586 after raiding the Caribbean, Lane and his surviving men eagerly accepted passage back to England. Grenville arrived shortly after with reinforcements, only to find the colony deserted, though he left a small detachment to maintain Raleigh's claim. Not deterred, Raleigh planned another attempt. In 1587, a new expedition departed, this time intended not as a military outpost but as a true settlement. About 115 men, women, and children embarked under the leadership of John White, a talented artist who had previously traveled with the explorers. Unlike the earlier expeditions, this group carried the promise of permanence, families, tools, and the determination to build lives in the New World. They aimed originally for the Chesapeake Bay, but circumstances diverted them to Roanoke once again. On August 18, 1587, White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, a symbol of hope and continuity for the fledgling colony. Yet optimism soon clashed with reality. The settlers found themselves short of supplies, vulnerable to hostile relationships with native groups, and isolated on a precarious island. The fragile community pleaded with White to return to England to seek aid. Reluctantly, he agreed, leaving behind his family, including his newborn granddaughter, with the promise to return swiftly. His timing, however, could not have been worse. Europe was on the brink of war. The Spanish Armada loomed, and England desperately needed ships for defense. White found himself unable to secure a vessel for his relief mission, delayed year after year by the pressing demands of national survival. When he finally returned in 1590, 3 long years had passed. He stepped ashore on Roanoke Island with anxious hope, only to find an eerie emptiness. The houses had been dismantled, the settlement appeared abandoned, and no sign of his family or the other colonists could be found. Yet there were no bodies, no signs of violence, only silence broken by the whispering trees and the surf. One clue remained carved into the wood of a post, the word CROATOAN. Another carving, crow, was discovered on a tree. White took this as a sign that the settlers had moved to CROATOAN Island, the homeland of their ally Manteo's people, located further south. But weather turned against him. Fierce storms forced his ships away before he could investigate further. He never saw the colony again. From that moment onward, the fate of the lost colony slipped into legend. Over the centuries, countless theories have emerged, each trying to fill the void of explanation left by the vanished settlers. Some argue the colonists simply relocated to CROATOAN Island and assimilated with the friendly Croatan tribe. Others believe they pushed inland toward the Chesapeake Bay or perhaps tried to sail back to England, only to perish at sea. More sinister suggestions involve conflict with neighboring tribes or starvation driving them to desperate ends. The absence of conclusive evidence has allowed speculation to thrive endlessly. One of the enduring possibilities is assimilation. The carving of CROATOAN seemed to point clearly to that destination, and later reports from European explorers suggested sightings of Native Americans with European features, light eyes, or English speech. John Lawson, who visited the area in 1701, noted that some descendants of the Hatteras tribe claimed their ancestors had white forebears who could read from books. Such testimonies, though difficult to verify, provide tantalizing hints that the colonists did not simply vanish but instead became woven into the fabric of indigenous societies. Another theory holds that the colonists, in search of better resources, moved inland toward the Chesapeake Bay, their intended destination from the beginning. Archaeological efforts in areas around Chesapeake and beyond have uncovered artifacts that could possibly be linked to the Roanoke settlers, but definitive connections remain elusive. Excavations on Hatteras Island have produced European tools and items dating to the late 16th century, supporting the CROATOAN assimilation idea, yet they do not provide absolute answers. The darker possibilities include disaster. Food shortages were a persistent threat, and it is not difficult to imagine the settlers succumbing to starvation or disease. Conflict with native tribes may have led to violence, though the absence of mass graves at the Roanoke site complicates that narrative. Some even suggest that the colonists may have split into smaller groups, scattering across the region in attempts to survive, their identities ultimately dissolving into other communities. As centuries passed, the Lost Colony became more than just a historical puzzle, it became a cultural myth, part of the folklore of America's origins. Writers, poets, and historians alike have been drawn to the mystery. The story embodies themes of survival, failure, and the collision between cultures. It also reflects the precariousness of colonial ventures in the New World, long before Jamestown and Plymouth became success stories. Unlike those settlements, Roanoke never had the chance to grow, yet its very disappearance ensured its immortality. Modern science has entered the search as well. Archaeologists have turned to advanced methods like DNA testing, ground-penetrating radar, and isotopic analysis to uncover traces of the colonists. Genetic studies seek to find links between modern descendants of local tribes and the English settlers, though results remain debated. Meanwhile, archaeological digs, such as those conducted by the First Colony Foundation, continue to unearth artifacts that spark both excitement and controversy. A map drawn by John White himself, known as the La Virginia Pars map, revealed hidden markings that may suggest the location of a fort further inland, fueling renewed efforts to pinpoint where the settlers might have gone. The enduring allure of Roanoke lies partly in its ambiguity. Human beings are storytellers by nature, and mysteries beg to be filled with meaning. The settlers of Roanoke may have simply lived out their lives in obscurity among native allies, yet because no definitive proof exists, the story invites endless reimagining. Was Virginia Dare raised among the Croatan? Did she grow to adulthood and become a mother of generations blending English and indigenous heritage? Or did her short life end tragically on a hungry island where the promises of empire evaporated into salt air? The Lost Colony also serves as a reminder of the hubris of empire. Raleigh and his contemporaries dreamed of riches and dominion, but they underestimated the sheer difficulty of carving out survival in an unfamiliar land without adequate preparation, supplies, or understanding of the environment. The Roanoke colonists were caught between the ambitions of empire and the unforgiving realities of frontier existence. Their failure underscored the fragility of such ventures and foreshadowed the immense struggles that would define early colonization. Even today, the shores of Roanoke Island are steeped in this sense of haunting. Tourists visit the site, walking the same ground where White once searched desperately for his family. Local legends flourish, such as ghostly sightings of figures among the trees or the cries of Virginia Dare carried on the wind. The story has inspired novels, plays, television shows, and endless retellings, each layering new interpretations upon the old mystery. At its core, The Lost Colony remains a deeply human story. It is not merely about geopolitics, colonization, or empire, but about families who dared to leave everything behind to build a life in a strange and uncertain world. These were not just names in a ledger but real people, men, women, children, who carried hopes, fears, and dreams. Their silence across the centuries is perhaps what gives the story its greatest power, for it forces us to confront the unknown and to imagine their fate in the absence of certainty. The puzzle of Roanoke may one day be solved through archaeology or science, or it may forever remain an enigma preserved in the shifting sands of time. Until then, it endures as America's first great mystery, a story of ambition, disappearance, and the eternal human urge to seek meaning in the unknown. And so the waves still crash upon Roanoke's shores, just as they did when White returned in despair in 1590, and the wind still whispers through the trees where the word, CROATOAN, was carved. Whether those letters pointed to survival, tragedy, or transformation, they remain the last voice of the colony, etched not only into wood but into the imagination of a nation still searching for answers. In the last quarter of the 16th century, England was standing at a crossroads of ambition and necessity. The seas were dominated by Spain, whose treasure fleets carried unimaginable wealth from the Americas to the coffers of Madrid, and whose empire stretched across continents. Queen Elizabeth I, brilliant and pragmatic, understood that for England to thrive, it had to stake its claim on the New World before the map was painted entirely in Spanish red and gold. It was into this context that Sir Walter Raleigh, one of her most trusted courtiers and adventurers, emerged as the man who might plant the English flag across the Atlantic. Raleigh, charming, daring, and politically astute, had already gained favor at court through both military service and his relentless charisma. He had fought in Ireland, he had earned knighthood, and he had become one of the Queen's favored companions. But in a world where courtly favor was fleeting and fortunes could change overnight, Raleigh knew he needed something monumental to secure his legacy. That something was empire. In 1584, Elizabeth granted Raleigh a royal charter that authorized him to discover, search, find out and view such remote heathen and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed of any Christian prince. It was not just a grant of land but a grant of destiny, offering Raleigh the chance to be the founder of England's first lasting colony in the Americas. The charter gave him rights of ownership, the ability to govern settlers, and the responsibility to establish a permanent presence. But there was a time limit. If he failed to establish a colony within 6 years, the rights would be voided. This urgency spurred Raleigh into action. He would not personally sail to the New World, but he would finance, plan, and organize the expeditions that would carry England's hopes across the ocean. Unlike the Spanish, who sought gold, silver, and immediate plunder, Raleigh envisioned something more enduring, a settlement that would not only bring wealth but also serve as a strategic base. Positioned on the eastern seaboard of North America, the colony could act as a launch point for English privateers to harass Spanish treasure ships as they passed through the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Raleigh's motives, however, were not purely strategic. He understood the power of myth and image. Naming the new land, Virginia, in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, he appealed to national pride and romanticized the venture. Pamphlets and reports circulated in London described the Americas as a paradise of resources, fertile soil, lush forests, abundant fish, and native peoples eager to trade. Such imagery ignited the imaginations of investors, courtiers, and adventurers alike. Raleigh had created not just a colonial scheme but a dream of expansion that aligned with England's rising self-image. Yet beneath the grandeur lay immense risks. Establishing a colony across the Atlantic required ships, supplies, manpower, and luck. The seas were treacherous, storms were frequent, and Spanish ships prowled the waters. The indigenous peoples of North America, while capable of hospitality, were also protective of their lands, and cultural misunderstandings often led to conflict. Disease, hunger, and isolation would test any settler's endurance. Raleigh was fully aware of these challenges, but the charter bound him to try regardless. Thus, in the spring of 1584, Raleigh dispatched his first reconnaissance mission under Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow. Their voyage would return with glowing reports, claiming they had found an Eden-like land off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They described wide rivers, fertile fields, and a climate suitable for English crops. They also brought back 2 Native Americans, Manteo and Wanchese, whose presence in London created fascination and intrigue. To Raleigh and his supporters, these early signs seemed to confirm that the Queen's Charter could indeed blossom into a triumph for England. But Raleigh's charter was more than just a legal document or a personal gamble, it was a statement of England's intent to join the ranks of great empires. Spain had its gold mines, Portugal had its spice routes, France had its fishing grounds and fur trade, and England had until now remained a marginal player. With this royal charter, Elizabeth was saying to her rivals that England would no longer be content to sit on the sidelines. The future of the kingdom would be tied to the oceans and to lands across the seas. What makes Raleigh's charter so pivotal in the story of the Lost Colony is that it set into motion everything that followed: the exploratory voyages, the first failed military outpost, and ultimately the fateful settlement of 1587 that would vanish into mystery. Without Raleigh's ambition and Elizabeth's backing, Roanoke would never have been attempted. And without that attempt, America's first great mystery might never have been born. Yet the charter also highlights the paradox of Roanoke. It was a product of vision and pride, but it underestimated the realities of survival. Raleigh dreamed of a colony that could serve both as a fortress against Spain and as a seed of English expansion, but his plans relied heavily on the assumption that settlers could adapt quickly to an unfamiliar world. The gap between vision and reality would prove devastating. In retrospect, Raleigh's charter marks the beginning of a chain of events that revealed both the promise and the peril of colonization. It was the first spark of empire, but it was also the first lesson in humility for the English, a reminder that the New World was not a blank canvas but a complex and challenging land. The disappearance of the Roanoke colonists can be traced directly back to this moment in 1584, when ambition outpaced preparedness and dreams outweighed practicalities. For Raleigh himself, the charter would be both his greatest claim and his lingering shadow. Though he never set foot on Roanoke, his name is forever tied to it, a symbol of both daring vision and tragic failure. And for America, the charter represents the first breath of a colonial story that would eventually define the nation, beginning not with triumph but with mystery, silence, and the haunting word carved into wood: CROATOAN. When Raleigh secured his royal charter, his first priority was to prove that the New World could indeed sustain an English settlement. Dreams of empire were all well and good in the echoing halls of Whitehall, but success depended on knowledge, of the geography, of the resources, and of the people who already lived there. Thus, in April of 1584, he commissioned an expedition led by two captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, to sail across the Atlantic and bring back reports. This was not to be a colony, not yet, but a reconnaissance mission, a scouting journey meant to test the truth of the glowing rumors that had already reached England. The voyage began with two small ships departing Plymouth in the spring, a relatively modest fleet compared to Spain's Grand Armadas, but sufficient for reconnaissance. Crossing the Atlantic was never an easy endeavor, particularly in the 16th century, but the journey was made without incident. After weeks at sea, the two vessels sighted land on July 4, 1584, near the coast of what is now North Carolina. They had arrived at the barrier islands that would become central to the story of Roanoke. What they found filled their reports with awe. The coastline was wild and beautiful, with broad sandy beaches, dense forests of oak, cedar, and pine, and waterways teeming with fish. Freshwater streams flowed inland, and the land appeared fertile and green. Barlow, in particular, wrote a glowing account, describing the region as the most plentiful, sweet, fruitful and wholesome of all the world. To Elizabethan eyes, this was no mere exaggeration but an invitation to imagine a second Eden awaiting English cultivation. One of the most important aspects of the voyage was contact with the indigenous people. The ships anchored off the coast of Roanoke Island, where they encountered members of the CROATOAN tribe, part of the larger Algonquian-speaking peoples of the region. The CROATOAN greeted the English with cautious hospitality, offering food, tobacco, and shells. Amadas and Barlow were impressed not only by the physical strength of the natives but also by their generosity. According to their accounts, the English were showered with gifts of venison, fish, and fruit, and in return, they offered European trinkets and goods. Barlow's descriptions of the people were romanticized, portraying them as noble, handsome, and living in harmony with their environment. He emphasized their friendliness, noting how quickly they developed a sense of kinship with the English. Chief Wingina, the leader of the CROATOAN, reportedly welcomed the strangers warmly, seeing them perhaps as potential allies in the complex web of tribal politics that defined the region. For the English, these first interactions seemed to confirm that settlement would be not only possible but welcomed. Yet even in this moment of apparent friendship, the seeds of misunderstanding were sown. The English viewed the natives as subjects to be, potential converts to Christianity, and allies against Spain. The natives, on the other hand, likely viewed the English as a temporary curiosity, useful for trade and perhaps as leverage against rival tribes. Neither side fully grasped the other's worldview, and though the initial encounter was peaceful, the gap between expectations would later prove disastrous. A defining moment of the voyage was the decision to bring two natives back to England, Manteo and Wanchese. They were chosen not only as representatives but as living bridges between the worlds. Manteo, from the friendly Croatan tribe, proved eager to learn about English culture and would become a loyal ally to the colonists in later years. Wanchese, however, was more skeptical. Though he traveled willingly, his impressions of England left him wary of English intentions. When the two men arrived in London, they caused a sensation at court. To Elizabethans who had never seen the people of the Americas, they were living proof of Raleigh's discoveries, a tangible sign that England's reach now extended across the Atlantic. Manteo and Wanchese provided valuable intelligence. Through them, English scholars and linguists began to piece together elements of the Algonquian language. Thomas Harriot, a mathematician and scientist who later traveled with the colonists, learned directly from them and created notes that would help future settlers communicate. These exchanges were not only practical but symbolic, underscoring the English belief that they could civilize and convert the people of the New World. The success of the first exploratory voyage cannot be overstated. Raleigh received the reports with satisfaction, presenting them to Queen Elizabeth, who was delighted with the idea of a new territory named in her honor, Virginia. The glowing descriptions of abundant resources convinced many at court that colonization was both feasible and promising. The voyage was heralded as proof that England could compete with Spain and that Raleigh's charter might indeed yield great rewards. But beneath the enthusiasm lay selective vision. Amadas and Barlow had seen the land during summer, when it was lush and plentiful. They had experienced the hospitality of one tribe, without yet witnessing the fragility of those alliances or the harsher side of survival during winter. Their reports, though genuine in admiration, painted too rosy a picture. This optimism would later blind Raleigh and others to the real difficulties that awaited settlers. For the time being, however, the mission was considered a resounding success. England had its first detailed glimpse of the land that would become central to its colonial ambitions. The excitement generated by Manteo and Wanchese at court stirred imaginations and gave Raleigh the credibility he needed to organize a larger venture. Investors were convinced, ships were prepared, and men were recruited. The dream of Virginia was taking shape, step by step. Looking back, the first exploratory voyage occupies a unique place in the Roanoke saga. It was a moment of hope, unclouded by the tragedies that would follow. Amadas and Barlow stood on untouched shores and saw possibility. They wrote with the wonder of discovery, unburdened by starvation, conflict, or disappearance. Their optimism helped set the stage for one of the most mysterious episodes in American history, but it also misled those who trusted their words too completely. The reports promised Eden, but what lay ahead was far more complicated. Without this initial voyage, however, Raleigh's charter might have languished as a dream on parchment. Amadas and Barlow turned imagination into tangible evidence, and in doing so, they propelled England into its first serious attempt at colonization. The echoes of their journey still linger on the Outer Banks, where the waters and forests they once described remain as a reminder of the moment when the English first glimpsed the land that would birth America's first great mystery. After the glowing reports from Amadas and Barlow in 1584, England's confidence soared. Sir Walter Raleigh wasted no time in preparing a more ambitious venture, this time, not just a reconnaissance mission, but a colony. The dream of establishing a permanent English presence in the New World had taken hold, and Raleigh was determined to prove that his charter could yield not only prestige but also practical results. In April 1585, Raleigh outfitted a fleet of 7 ships, the largest yet assembled for his American venture. The expedition was commanded by his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, a seasoned naval officer known for his boldness and, at times, rash temper. Accompanying him was Ralph Lane, who would serve as the colony's governor. Also on board was the scientist Thomas Harriot and the painter John White, whose illustrations would later provide invaluable records of the people and landscapes of Roanoke. Together, they represented not only the sword but also the pen and the brush, England's first attempt to combine conquest, science, and art in the New World. The voyage across the Atlantic was arduous. At one point, Grenville's fleet captured a Spanish ship, a reminder that the shadow of Spain loomed over every English enterprise. When the expedition finally reached the Outer Banks in late June, they navigated the dangerous inlets with difficulty. The shoals and sandbars claimed one of their ships, along with much of its food supply, a loss that would later haunt the colony. Still, the English managed to establish a foothold on Roanoke Island, welcomed initially by the CROATOAN people under Chief Wingina. The settlers built a fort, and for a time, the colony showed promise. Harriot, keenly observant, studied the flora, fauna, and natural resources, recording details of native crops such as maize, beans, and squash. He noted that the soil seemed fertile, the forests abundant with game, and the waters filled with fish. White sketched and painted vivid depictions of the landscape and the people, creating some of the earliest visual records of Native American life on the Atlantic coast. These accounts would later circulate in England, shaping the European imagination of the New World for generations. But beneath the surface, trouble brewed. Relations with the CROATOAN and other tribes began to sour. At first, trade was friendly, with natives providing food in exchange for English goods. Yet the balance was fragile. The English, accustomed to European notions of ownership and supply, grew increasingly demanding, while the natives faced pressures from both resource shortages and the disruptive presence of foreign settlers. Misunderstandings escalated into hostility. By the fall, tensions had reached a breaking point. Grenville, after establishing the colony, returned to England, leaving Lane in charge with about 107 men. Unlike the families who would later come in 1587, these colonists were almost entirely soldiers, craftsmen, and adventurers, ill-suited to building a self-sustaining settlement. They depended heavily on native goodwill, and when that goodwill frayed, survival became precarious. Lane's leadership was harsh, and his men struggled with dwindling supplies. Desperation set in. In 1586, hostilities erupted between the English and the CROATOAN. A violent clash culminated in the killing of Chief Wingina, who had once welcomed the strangers. Far from securing stability, the English had now alienated their primary source of aid. The colony, beset by hunger and isolation, teetered on collapse. At this critical juncture, fate intervened. In June 1586, Sir Francis Drake, fresh from his raids in the Caribbean, appeared off the coast with a powerful fleet. He offered Lane and his men relief, supplies, and even the option to return to England. After debate, the colonists chose to abandon Roanoke. They boarded Drake's ships and sailed back across the Atlantic. Their experiment in colonization ended in failure. When they arrived in England, however, they brought with them new crops that would forever change Europe: maize, tobacco, and the potato. Though the colony itself had failed, the cultural and agricultural exchange marked a turning point in the global story of food and trade. Raleigh's ambitions had not been entirely wasted. Ironically, just days after Lane and his men departed, Grenville returned with reinforcements and supplies. Finding the settlement deserted, he left behind a small garrison of 15 men to maintain England's claim before sailing back to England. Those men would vanish without a trace, their fate as mysterious as the later Lost Colony. Looking back, the first colony attempt of 1585 illustrates the gap between vision and reality. Raleigh and his backers imagined a thriving English outpost, but they underestimated the challenges of survival in an unfamiliar land. The settlers lacked farming families, women, and children, the social fabric necessary for permanence. They treated the land as a military base rather than a community, relying on force and intimidation rather than cooperation. Their approach guaranteed conflict rather than harmony with the native peoples. Yet, this failure did not end the dream. Instead, it fueled the desire to try again, this time with a new strategy. Lessons were learned. A colony needed not only soldiers but also families, farmers, and stability. When Raleigh organized the next expedition in 1587, he envisioned a settlement rooted in domestic life, not just martial presence. Still, the legacy of the 1585 colony lingers in history as a warning. It was the first taste of the New World's difficulties, a harsh reminder that colonization required more than ambition and royal charters. It required adaptation, resilience, and an understanding of the people and land already there. Without those, even the most determined efforts would collapse. The abandoned fort on Roanoke Island, left behind by Lane and his men, would stand as a silent witness when new settlers arrived 2 years later. They would inherit not just the land but the memory of conflict, the echoes of mistrust, and the haunting uncertainty of those first attempts. The stage was set for the next chapter, one that would end not in evacuation but in disappearance, the mystery of the lost colony itself. The failure of the 1585 colony under Ralph Lane could have ended Raleigh's American ambitions. Many at court doubted whether England had the capacity to establish a foothold in the New World, and investors hesitated to risk more ships and supplies. Yet Raleigh, driven by both determination and the ticking clock of his charter, refused to abandon the dream. If the military outpost had collapsed, perhaps a true settlement, one built on families rather than soldiers, could succeed. Thus was born the Second Colony Attempt, an expedition that would mark both the high point of Raleigh's vision and the beginning of America's first great mystery. Unlike Lane's predominantly male garrison, the 1587 expedition was designed as a civilian settlement. About 115 colonists set sail, including men, women, and children, the first English families to attempt permanent residence in the New World. They were led by John White, an artist who had traveled with the earlier mission and who was appointed governor of the new colony. White's leadership was significant. He was not a soldier like Lane, but rather a man of science and culture, someone who envisioned community rather than conquest. Among the settlers was White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, accompanied by her husband Ananias Dare. The expedition departed England in May 1587 aboard 3 ships, under the overall command of Simon Fernandez, a Portuguese pilot who had previously sailed for Raleigh. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, which had been identified as a more suitable site for colonization than Roanoke. The Chesapeake region promised better harbors, more fertile land, and safer positioning. But fate had other plans. Fernandez, for reasons still debated by historians, refused to take the settlers further north and instead deposited them once again on Roanoke Island in late July. When the colonists landed, they discovered traces of the 15 men left behind by Grenville 2 years earlier, but the settlement was deserted and signs of struggle suggested violence had occurred. The new arrivals had little choice but to re-establish themselves in the same location, despite its known difficulties. They rebuilt shelters and began the arduous task of surviving in an environment that had already proven hostile. Almost immediately, the colony faced hardships. Supplies were insufficient, relations with local tribes were strained, and the settlers felt vulnerable on the exposed island. Though they attempted to forge alliances, particularly with the Croatan people under Manteo, hostility from other groups created constant danger. Food was scarce, and morale waned. Amid these difficulties, however, a moment of hope shone brightly. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Her birth was celebrated as a symbol of renewal and permanence. Virginia represented not only the hope of her family but also the idea that English life could take root on American soil. Her name, Virginia, tied to the land itself, became a powerful emblem for the colony's purpose. But symbolic births could not fill empty stomachs. The settlers soon realized that without substantial resupply, they could not endure. The colonists begged John White to return to England to secure food, tools, and reinforcements. White resisted at first, reluctant to abandon his daughter and granddaughter, but eventually he relented. Promising to return quickly, he set sail for England in late 1587, leaving behind 115 souls whose survival now depended on his return. White's voyage back to England was plagued by misfortune. When he arrived, he found the nation in the throes of crisis. Spain was preparing its armada, and every English ship was commandeered for defense. Queen Elizabeth, fearing invasion, forbade ships from being sent across the Atlantic for relief missions. White pleaded for aid, but his appeals were drowned out by the demands of war. It was not until 1590, 3 long years later, that John White finally secured passage back to Roanoke. His heart must have been heavy with dread as his ship approached the island in August of that year. What he found would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. The settlement was abandoned. Houses had been dismantled, not destroyed, suggesting an orderly departure. There were no signs of bodies, no evidence of violence, no smoke from cooking fires. The silence of the island was total. The only clues were carvings, the word, CROATOAN, etched onto a wooden post and the letters, CRO, carved into a nearby tree. White took these as signs that the colonists had moved to CROATOAN Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, the home of their allies. Yet storms prevented him from investigating further. His ship was battered, supplies were low, and the crew refused to risk their lives in continued searches. Heartbroken, White was forced to return to England, never again to see his daughter, his granddaughter, or any of the colonists. Their fate was sealed in silence. This second colony attempt, though initially full of promise, became the stuff of legend because of its disappearance. Unlike Lane's men, who returned with Drake, the 1587 settlers left no definitive trace. They did not come home, nor did their graves mark their passing. They simply vanished, leaving behind one of the most famous unanswered questions in history. The symbolic weight of this attempt cannot be overstated. It represented England's first true effort at building community in the New World, complete with families, births, and the structures of domestic life. Its disappearance was thus more devastating than the failure of a military garrison. These were not soldiers trained to accept loss, they were civilians, the human heart of colonization, who vanished into mystery. For Raleigh, the failure was catastrophic. He had poured money, resources, and reputation into the venture, and the disappearance of the settlers tarnished his standing. Though he continued to dream of empire, the shadow of Roanoke followed him, and in later years his enemies used it as a weapon to discredit his ambitions. Yet for history, the story of the second colony attempt endures as both tragedy and myth. Virginia Dare became a symbol of innocence lost, her name invoked in countless stories, legends, and even political rhetoric centuries later. The word, CROATOAN, became one of the most enigmatic markers in historical memory, a single word that promised answers yet delivered only deeper questions. The second attempt at Roanoke was not just another failure, it was the birth of America's first great mystery, a puzzle that continues to fascinate scholars, archaeologists, and storytellers to this day. When John White made the difficult decision to return to England in 1587 to request supplies, he left behind his daughter, Eleanor Dare, her husband Ananias Dare, and their newborn child, Virginia Dare, as well as over 100 other settlers. It was a painful choice, but one he considered necessary, for the colony was dangerously short on food and tools, and relations with neighboring tribes were uncertain. White believed his trip would be quick, perhaps a few months at most, and that he could soon return with fresh provisions and reinforcements to secure the survival of the settlement. But fate had other plans, and his journey back became one of the most frustrating and consequential delays in colonial history. When he arrived in England in late 1587, he was immediately caught in the turbulence of European politics. England was at war with Spain, and every available ship was being prepared to defend the realm from the looming threat of the Spanish Armada. Queen Elizabeth I and her government had no interest in sparing ships or manpower for a faraway colony while the very survival of England was at stake. White found himself in an impossible position, desperate to return to Roanoke, but unable to secure transport. For nearly 2 years, John White waited. His requests for ships were denied again and again, or else promised and then withdrawn at the last moment when they were requisitioned for the war effort. Finally, in 1588, he managed to secure 2 small vessels with the help of private investors rather than the crown. But disaster struck. The ships were attacked by French privateers before they ever reached America. Forced to retreat to England, White's hopes collapsed once again. The colonists, his daughter, his granddaughter, and the rest of the settlers, remained stranded, with no idea if rescue would ever come. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 should have opened new opportunities, but by then, England was exhausted. Its navy had suffered damage, its economy was strained, and its leaders were reluctant to divert resources to colonial experiments that had already shown signs of failure. White's pleas fell on deaf ears for much of the following year. The colonists, meanwhile, had now been without contact from England for well over 2 years. At last, in 1590, White was able to convince Raleigh and other backers to send an expedition to Roanoke. It was not as well funded or as well staffed as he had hoped, but it was enough to get him across the Atlantic. His heart must have been heavy with both hope and dread as the ship sailed westward. He imagined seeing his granddaughter Virginia, now nearly 3 years old, walking and talking. He may have dreamed of a joyful reunion with his daughter Eleanor, and of finding the colony thriving despite the hardships. Yet deep inside, he must also have feared the worst, that hunger, conflict, or disease had decimated them. The voyage itself was plagued with difficulties. At one point, the expedition was delayed by storms and the navigators struggled to make good time across the ocean. Each setback only deepened White's anxiety, for he knew that every passing day increased the risk that the settlers might not survive. By the time they finally reached the coast of North Carolina, it was already late summer of 1590. White had been gone 3 long years, and everything hinged on what he would find when he set foot again on Roanoke Island. The moment of his return was both dramatic and heartbreaking. As the rescue ships anchored offshore, they attempted to signal the colonists by playing familiar tunes on trumpets and drums, hoping to hear a response from the settlement. But the island was eerily silent. There were no shouts, no fires, no movements in the forest. White and his men went ashore and quickly realized something was terribly wrong. The fort stood abandoned, houses were dismantled, gardens were overgrown, not a single colonist was in sight. But the most chilling discovery was carved into the wood of a post, the word CROATOAN. Another carving on a nearby tree read only Crow. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, no blood, no burnt remains, but also no clues to indicate where the settlers had gone, except for that cryptic word. White had instructed the colonists before he left that, if they ever needed to move, they should carve the name of their destination somewhere visible, and if they were in danger, they should add a cross symbol. The absence of a cross suggested they had left voluntarily. White's immediate hope was that they had relocated to CROATOAN Island, now known as Hatteras Island, the home of the Croatan tribe who had been friendly toward the English. He pleaded with the expedition leaders to sail there next. Unfortunately, the weather turned against them. Fierce storms battered the coast, damaging the ships and forcing the commanders to abandon the search. White was heartbroken. He was so close, perhaps only a short journey away from his family and the colonists, but circumstances forced him back to England once again. He never saw his daughter or granddaughter again, and he died years later still not knowing their fate. This tragic sequence of events highlights how much the destiny of the Roanoke colony was shaped not just by the settlers' own struggles but also by larger geopolitical forces. If the Spanish Armada had not threatened England in 1588, perhaps White could have returned sooner with supplies, and the colony might have survived. If the privateers had not attacked his ships, perhaps rescue could have arrived a year earlier. If the storms had not forced his hand in 1590, he might have found them at CROATOAN and reunited with his family. But history is made of such fragile chains of chance, and in the case of Roanoke, every link seemed to break against the colonists' hopes. Thus, John White's return, or rather, his delayed and failed return, became one of the central tragedies of the Roanoke story. It wasn't simply that the colonists vanished, but that their would-be rescuer was constantly prevented from reaching them by events beyond his control. The mystery of Roanoke is as much about these missed opportunities as it is about what ultimately happened to the settlers. White's heartbreak, his unanswered questions, and his eternal sense of loss continued to echo through the centuries, making the tale of the lost colony not just a mystery of history, but a profoundly human story of longing, failure, and fate. When John White left Roanoke in late 1587, his plan was simple enough on paper. He would sail back across the Atlantic, rally supplies, gather additional settlers if possible, and then return within months to strengthen the fragile new community on Roanoke Island. The settlers had made their needs clear. They required food, farming tools, and reinforcements to help them deal with the hardships of the land and the uncertainty of living among unfamiliar native tribes. White, as governor of the colony, carried the weight of their expectations. His departure was bittersweet. He had left behind not only the settlers under his leadership but also his daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. White must have believed he would be back in a short span of time, arms laden with supplies, ready to build the kind of sustainable community he had promised them. But fate and politics had other plans. As soon as he reached England, White's mission collided with the storm of international conflict. England was on the brink of war with the greatest naval power of the era, Spain. The Spanish Armada loomed as a threat to England's very survival. Queen Elizabeth I and her advisors understood that every ship, every cannon, and every sailor would be needed to protect the homeland. Colonial ventures, however grand their vision, were secondary to national defense. Thus, when White sought ships and provisions to return to Roanoke, he found doors closed to him. Captains were reluctant to divert vessels away from the urgent defense effort, and the Crown itself forbade certain ships from leaving English waters. The Spanish Armada crisis of 1588 was more than just a logistical inconvenience, it was a defining historical event. Spain, led by King Philip II, had grown impatient with English privateers raiding its treasure fleets and with Elizabeth's open support of Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. The Armada was meant to crush England, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholic dominance. Against this backdrop, John White's pleas for a colonial relief mission seemed almost trivial compared to the existential threat facing England itself. His appeals likely fell on sympathetic ears, but sympathy could not override the reality of imminent invasion. The Armada finally sailed in July 1588, and White, like the rest of England, had no choice but to wait. The months stretched on as the English Navy, led by figures like Sir Francis Drake and Lord Charles Howard, prepared to defend the nation. Naval resources that might have been spared for a transatlantic voyage were locked in tense standoffs with Spain's galleons. When the climactic battles occurred in the English Channel and off the coast of Calais, White must have followed every development with mixed emotions: relief that his nation survived, despair that his colonists remained abandoned thousands of miles away. England's victory over the Armada was celebrated as miraculous, a triumph of smaller, more agile ships against a seemingly invincible foe. But for White, even in victory, the delay meant that precious years had slipped away, years during which the fate of Roanoke grew ever more uncertain. When the Armada was finally defeated, White renewed his campaign to secure ships. Yet the war with Spain did not end in 1588, tensions lingered, and piracy continued. Ships were still hard to come by, and few captains wished to undertake the dangerous journey to America, where storms, hostile encounters, and poor navigation could spell disaster. Even when White managed to arrange passage, the voyages were often disrupted. One attempt to sail in 1588 ended with the ships being commandeered for privateering against the Spanish, leaving White once again stranded in England. It wasn't until 1590, 3 long years after his departure, that White was able to return. By then, his fears must have grown unbearable. Colonies were fragile enterprises even in the best of conditions, and Roanoke had begun under less than ideal circumstances. The settlers had been left without a steady supply chain, surrounded by tribes whose relations were unstable, and cut off from any means of communicating their plight to England. White must have dreaded what awaited him, yet clung to the hope that his family and the others had somehow persevered. The delay caused by the Spanish Armada was, in hindsight, the cruelest twist of timing. Had White returned in 1588 with supplies and reinforcements, the story of Roanoke might have been radically different. The settlers might have survived, establishing the first permanent English colony decades before Jamestown. Virginia Dare might have grown up to embody the vision of a New World Englishwoman. Instead, history left only silence, a vanished settlement, and a single word carved on a post: CROATOAN. Historians often debate whether the colonists could have survived those 3 years without assistance. Some argue they might have integrated with neighboring tribes early on, finding refuge and sustenance among them. Others suggest that starvation or disease claimed them swiftly, especially without new tools and supplies. Whatever the truth, the delay meant that when White did return, he was no longer a rescuer arriving in time but a mourner stepping into the aftermath of tragedy. In the larger tapestry of history, White's delay illustrates the precarious balance of ambition and reality in early colonization. England's imperial dreams collided with the demands of survival against European rivals. A single war in the Old World reshaped the destiny of an entire community in the New World. The Armada had been defeated, but in that victory, the colony of Roanoke had been lost. When John White set out with the settlers in 1587, he had every intention of staying and building a thriving English colony in the New World. He was not just the governor of this new settlement, he was also a father and grandfather. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, had accompanied him, and her child, Virginia Dare, was born in the settlement, becoming the first English child born in the Americas. This gave White a deeply personal connection to the fate of the colony, far beyond his political or exploratory responsibilities. Yet within weeks of arrival, the colonists faced serious challenges: limited supplies, tense relations with neighboring tribes, and uncertainty about how to sustain themselves through the coming seasons. The colony was fragile, and everyone knew it. It soon became clear that without additional resources and reinforcement from England, survival would be nearly impossible. The colonists turned to White, urging him to return to England and plead for immediate assistance. He was reluctant to leave, for his family and all the settlers depended on him. But the consensus was unavoidable: someone had to go back, and White, as governor and the one most respected by the settlers, was the obvious choice. He finally agreed, promising to return quickly with supplies, manpower, and perhaps more families to bolster their fragile foothold in the New World. His departure was heavy with emotion. The colonists watched their leader and loved one sail away, clinging to his promise of return. White himself must have felt torn in ways few men could imagine, leaving behind his daughter and infant granddaughter in a land that was already proving unpredictable and dangerous. When White returned to England later in 1587, he anticipated arranging a supply voyage quickly. But fate, politics, and the tides of history conspired against him. England was on the brink of war with Spain, the greatest naval power of the age. Tensions had been escalating for years, and by the late 1580s, Spain was preparing the mighty armada that would sail against England in 1588. In such a climate, every available ship, sailor, and resource was commandeered for national defense. Securing passage for a resupply mission to Roanoke was no longer a simple matter of money or logistics, it became entangled in the very survival of England itself. White tried desperately to raise support. He lobbied investors, merchants, and even Sir Walter Raleigh, the original sponsor of the expedition. But time and again, his efforts were stalled. Ships were diverted to military use, supplies were hoarded for England's defense, and private investors were hesitant to risk their fortunes when war threatened to make transatlantic voyages even more perilous. White's frustration must have been immense. He had left behind more than 100 people, his own family among them, with a promise of swift return. Instead, he found himself mired in bureaucracy, delays, and the iron grip of global conflict. Finally, in 1588, he managed to secure passage aboard 2 small ships. But the voyage ended in disaster. The vessels were attacked by French privateers before reaching the New World, forcing White to abandon the mission and return to England once again. By now, he was haunted by the image of his daughter, granddaughter, and fellow settlers waiting for supplies that never arrived. Each passing month must have weighed on him like a leaden anchor. The war with Spain dragged on, consuming England's attention and ensuring that no large-scale resupply mission could be mounted. It wasn't until 1590, 3 years after he had left Roanoke, that White finally secured another opportunity to return. He sailed with a fleet of privateers who agreed to detour briefly to Roanoke on their way to plundering Spanish ships in the Caribbean. For White, this was a long-delayed chance to fulfill his promise and reunite with his family. As his ship approached the coast of North Carolina in August 1590, his heart must have pounded with anticipation. He imagined the colonists waiting for him, perhaps struggling but still alive, eager to see the long-awaited sails of an English vessel cresting the horizon. But the reality that greeted him was far different, and far more haunting. When White and his men landed on Roanoke Island, they found the settlement eerily deserted. Houses were dismantled, structures were overgrown, and no human presence remained. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, no battle scars, but also no colonists. Instead, White found a single clue carved into a post, the word CROATOAN. Nearby, the letters CRO were carved into a tree. To White, this was both a mystery and a faint glimmer of hope. Before he had left in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a system. If they moved, they would carve a message into a tree or structure to indicate their new location. If they were in danger, they would carve a cross as well. The absence of a cross suggested they had not been attacked but had relocated willingly. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, today Hatteras Island, home to the Croatan tribe who had sometimes been friendly to the English. White believed this must mean the colonists had moved there. His excitement grew. Perhaps his family was still alive, living with the Croatans, waiting for his return. He urged his crew to sail to CROATOAN immediately. But here, fate once again turned cruel. The weather grew violent, storms threatened their ships, and the privateers who had brought White across the ocean grew restless. Their mission was not to find settlers but to hunt Spanish treasure, and they refused to risk their ships any further. Despite White's desperate pleas, the decision was made to abandon the search. White was forced to leave America behind, returning to England without ever knowing the fate of his family or the colony he had led. For White, this must have been a torment beyond words. He had fulfilled his duty in returning, but circumstances beyond his control had kept him from saving his loved ones. In the years that followed, he lived with the unanswered question of what had become of his daughter, granddaughter, and the other colonists. His writings express sorrow and frustration, and though there were rumors and reports of survivors in the years that followed, White never saw them again. His last years were shrouded in mystery as well, and he faded into obscurity in England, another casualty of the Roanoke saga. This moment, the governor's return to an empty colony, has become one of the most haunting images in American history. The word, CROATOAN, carved into the wood, stands as one of the most famous unsolved clues of all time, sparking centuries of speculation. To some, it suggested assimilation with the Croatan tribe. To others, it hinted at a larger migration or even tragedy. For White, it represented both the possibility of hope and the cruel reality that he would never know the truth. His story underscores the human cost of exploration and colonization, not just in physical lives lost, but in the anguish of families separated by oceans, politics, and fate. When John White finally set foot back on Roanoke Island in August of 1590, the scene that unfolded before him was not at all what he had imagined during those long, frustrating years in England. For 3 years he had been haunted by the thought of his family, his daughter Eleanor, his son-in-law Ananias Dare, and most of all his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. He had imagined tears of joy, warm embraces, and a bustling colony that had grown despite the odds. Instead, he was met with an eerie silence, a settlement that seemed frozen in time yet stripped of life, and clues that raised more questions than answers. This moment would mark the beginning of one of America's greatest enduring mysteries. To understand the weight of White's return, it's important to recall the circumstances that had delayed him so long. After leaving Roanoke in 1587 to secure much-needed supplies, White had intended to return quickly. The colony was still fragile, lacking provisions and tools necessary for long-term survival. Yet England was suddenly thrown into chaos by the looming threat of the Spanish Armada. Every ship, every resource, every capable sailor was diverted to the defense of the realm. White, a man of modest rank and limited influence, found his requests pushed aside as the nation prepared for war against Spain. Even when he did secure passage, storms, piracy, and the political climate conspired against him. By the time he finally returned in 1590, 3 years had passed, and his heart was heavy with dread. As White's ship approached Roanoke Island, he and the crew strained their eyes for signs of life. Smoke rising from chimneys, figures moving along the shoreline, the sound of voices, anything that would confirm the colonists' survival. Instead, they were met with an unsettling emptiness. The once vibrant settlement seemed abandoned, though not destroyed. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, and no fires burning. It was as though the people had simply walked away. White and the men made their way through the settlement with growing unease. The houses were dismantled in an orderly way, not ruined by conflict. Personal belongings were missing, suggesting the colonists had packed and left deliberately. But the greatest mystery lay carved into the wooden structures of the settlement. On one tree, the letters, Crow, were etched deeply. On the palisade post of the fort, a single word was inscribed, CROATOAN. To White, this message sparked both relief and despair. Before he had left Roanoke in 1587, it had been agreed that if the colonists were forced to move, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or a post. If they were under duress or danger, they were to carve a cross above the name. There was no cross. That meant, at least in theory, they had moved willingly. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, modern-day Hatteras Island, and the home of the Croatan people, who had sometimes been allies of the English. White hoped desperately that this meant his family and the settlers had relocated there. Yet the relief was short-lived. A violent storm prevented White's crew from sailing to CROATOAN immediately. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the sailors grew restless. They were privateers by nature, more interested in raiding Spanish ships than conducting a search for settlers in an unforgiving wilderness. White pleaded with them, reminding them of his daughter and granddaughter, but he had little authority. The storm battered their ships, and the men insisted on leaving the area before they were trapped or wrecked. Against his will, White was forced to abandon the search. The weight of that decision must have been unbearable. He had come so far, endured so much, and at the very moment when he stood on the brink of discovery, fate intervened once again. He never saw his daughter or granddaughter again. History records that he returned to England, broken and defeated, carrying with him the mystery of the vanished colony. He never gave up hope, but no evidence ever surfaced to confirm what became of the Roanoke colonists. The word, CROATOAN, would echo through history like a ghostly whisper. For centuries, scholars, explorers, and archaeologists have returned to that clue, trying to unravel its meaning. Was it a straightforward indication that the settlers had joined the Croatan people on Hatteras Island? Or was it a decoy, a last desperate signal before disaster struck? The absence of clear evidence makes this moment in 1590 all the more haunting. Had White been able to reach CROATOAN Island, perhaps the mystery would have been solved. Perhaps he would have found the colonists thriving among the Croatan tribe, or at least discovered traces of their fate. Instead, his forced retreat sealed the colony's disappearance into legend. What is striking about White's account is the lack of violence at the site. The settlers had not been massacred by hostile tribes, as some feared. Their departure was deliberate, organized, and seemingly hopeful. They had carved a message for White, expecting him to return and follow their trail. That suggests they believed in his promise to come back quickly, a promise broken by forces beyond his control. The tragedy lies not just in the colonists' disappearance, but in the cruel twist of history that denied them reunion with their leader and kin. The emotional toll on White cannot be overstated. To be so close to the truth, only to be turned away, must have been devastating. He died years later in England, never knowing the fate of his family. His final memories of Roanoke were not of joyful reunion but of silence, abandonment, and a carved word that offered only tantalizing hints of survival. The mystery of White's return in 1590 has since become a defining moment in early American history. It captures the fragility of those first colonial ventures, the dangers of distance, and the unforgiving nature of both politics and the natural world. It also highlights the very human element of the story: love, hope, fear, and loss. White was not just a governor or a leader, he was a father and grandfather searching for his family in an unfamiliar and hostile land. That August day in 1590, as White stared at the carved word, CROATOAN, he stood on the threshold of discovery but was pushed back by circumstance. In many ways, that word has come to symbolize the lost promise of Roanoke itself, an unfinished story, a clue without resolution, a reminder that history does not always yield its secrets. It is this ambiguity, this haunting uncertainty, that has kept the lost colony alive in the imagination of generations. When John White finally returned to Roanoke in 1590 after being delayed for 3 long years, he expected to be reunited with his daughter, his son-in-law, and most importantly, his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, who had become a symbol of hope and continuity for the settlers. The reunion never came. Instead, what awaited him was the most haunting scene in early American history. The colony was completely deserted. The houses that had once stood as a symbol of England's foothold in the New World were dismantled or overgrown, the fort appeared abandoned, and there was no sign of life. No graves, no bodies, and no personal belongings were left behind. It was as though the colony had simply evaporated. White's initial reaction was confusion mixed with dread. His eyes caught two peculiar carvings, the letters, Crow, etched into a tree and the full word, CROATOAN, carved on a wooden post. The marks were deliberate and neatly done, not hurriedly scratched as if in distress. This detail calmed White slightly because, before he had left in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a code: if they were forced to leave or faced trouble, they should carve the name of their new destination into a visible spot. If they were in danger, they would also carve a Maltese cross to signal distress. There was no cross, only the word CROATOAN. To White, this suggested that the colonists had relocated to CROATOAN Island, about 50 miles away, where the Croatan people, led by Chief Manteo, had shown friendliness toward the English in earlier encounters. This offered a ray of hope. Perhaps the settlers had integrated with the tribe for survival, living peacefully under their protection. White urged his crew to sail to CROATOAN Island immediately to confirm the theory, but bad weather and dwindling supplies thwarted their efforts. The ship's captain refused to risk further delays, and White was forced to return to England empty-handed, without ever discovering the fate of his family or the settlers. It was a heartbreak that would torment him until his death. The absence of any evidence fueled endless speculation. Why dismantle the houses? Were they reused for new shelters elsewhere? Why leave no trace of valuables or tools? Did the settlers leave in an organized way, or were they forced? The word, CROATOAN, was both a clue and a mystery. It pointed to a direction, but no one ever followed up successfully at the time. Future expeditions that tried to investigate were cut short by conflicts, lack of funding, or shifting priorities. The fact that the colonists vanished without signs of a struggle fascinated historians and storytellers for centuries. It suggested a peaceful relocation, but if so, why had no one ever found definitive evidence of them among the Croatan people? Later explorers and settlers reported rumors of Native Americans with gray eyes, lighter hair, or English-style clothing, which fueled the idea of assimilation. Yet none of these accounts could be conclusively tied to Roanoke. For John White, the tragedy was personal. He had risked everything to help establish this colony, and the people lost included his own kin. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, became more than a missing child. She grew into a legend, a symbol of both hope and loss. In later centuries, she was romanticized as a mythical figure in folklore, representing the spirit of America, innocence, and resilience. White's return in 1590 marked the point at which Roanoke shifted from a struggling settlement into a historical enigma. From that moment on, it was not just about a failed colony but about an unresolved disappearance. The word, CROATOAN, has since entered the lexicon of mystery, appearing in books, plays, and even popular culture as a shorthand for things inexplicable. Some even ascribe supernatural significance to it, weaving it into ghost stories and tales of curses. In reality, White's return and the carvings provided the best lead that historians had, but because he was unable to follow through, the trail went cold. That missed opportunity has haunted every researcher since. If only the ship's captain had agreed to go to CROATOAN Island, we might not be speaking of Roanoke as a mystery at all. The answers could have been found then and there. Instead, the combination of misfortune, poor timing, and natural forces locked the truth away, leaving future generations to guess, investigate, and wonder. Thus, John White's return in 1590 was not just a moment of loss, it was the crystallization of America's first great mystery. What he found, or rather what he didn't find, ensured that the lost colony of Roanoke would never fade into obscurity but remain forever unsolved, a question mark written into the nation's earliest history. When John White returned in 1590 to find the Roanoke colony abandoned, he left behind one of the most enduring puzzles in American history. No bodies, no evidence of war, and only the word, CROATOAN, carved into wood were found. From that moment forward, scholars, explorers, and ordinary people alike have speculated on what could have happened to the 115 settlers. Several theories stand out, each with its own evidence and counterarguments. One of the most compelling and widely accepted theories is that the settlers relocated to CROATOAN Island and integrated with the Native American tribe living there. The CROATOANs, under Chief Manteo, had been allies of the English during earlier expeditions. They had shown hospitality, and some of their people had even traveled to England with explorers. The carving, CROATOAN, directly supports this theory. Since no distress symbol was found, it suggested the settlers moved voluntarily, not under duress. Additionally, later reports from English colonists in the 1600s mentioned Native Americans with European features, gray eyes, lighter hair, and even English-style clothing, which hinted at intermarriage or cultural blending. Some oral traditions among the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina also claim descent from the lost colonists. However, the theory lacks direct archaeological evidence. Despite digs on Hatteras Island, formerly CROATOAN Island, no definitive English settlement materials linked directly to Roanoke have been uncovered in large enough quantities to confirm full relocation. Still, many historians consider assimilation the most plausible explanation, especially given the settlers' desperate need for food, protection, and allies. Another possibility is that the colonists moved inland toward the Chesapeake Bay or further west in search of fertile land and better resources. Some maps and notes from the period hint at an intended relocation, and later Jamestown colonists heard rumors of English settlers living among native tribes inland. Archaeological evidence adds weight to this theory. A site known as Site X on the Albemarle Sound produced artifacts that seem English in origin: copper, slate, and pieces of weaponry. These objects could suggest that at least some Roanoke settlers survived and attempted to establish a new settlement inland. The challenge with this theory is that there's no record of White ever mentioning plans for an inland move, and the only direct clue left behind was CROATOAN. Yet, it's possible the settlers split into smaller groups, some moving to CROATOAN Island, others inland, which would explain why conclusive evidence remains elusive. Colonial life in the late 1500s was brutally hard. Supplies were scarce, the soil was not well suited to English farming methods, and relations with hostile tribes like the CROATOAN were tense. Without regular resupply missions from England, the settlers faced hunger, contaminated water, and new diseases. This theory suggests that the settlers may have succumbed to famine or disease and gradually perished. In such a case, their remains might have been buried or scattered in ways that were never recovered. But this explanation doesn't account for the dismantling of buildings or the CROATOAN message, both of which imply deliberate movement rather than death in place. Another theory is that the settlers fell victim to hostilities from local tribes. Relations between English colonists and some native groups were tense and violent, especially given the English habit of demanding food, occupying land, and showing aggression. It's possible that a conflict broke out, leading to the massacre of settlers. However, White found no evidence of battle, no burned structures, and no human remains. If a massacre had taken place, there should have been signs of destruction. For this reason, most historians believe large-scale violence is unlikely. Smaller skirmishes could have occurred, but they wouldn't explain the colony's total disappearance. At the time, Spain and England were bitter rivals, locked in war for supremacy on the seas. The Spanish already had colonies in Florida and were determined to keep the English out of the Americas. Some historians argue that Spanish forces may have discovered and destroyed the Roanoke colony. This is plausible, as Spain had spies tracking English voyages. However, no records in Spanish archives confirm such an attack. Furthermore, White found no evidence of destruction by fire or battle, which one would expect from a raid. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are notorious for violent storms and shifting geography. Some researchers propose that a hurricane or series of storms could have destroyed the colony's ships, shelters, and food supplies, forcing survivors to scatter or perish. Rising waters and erosion also make it possible that any evidence of the colony was literally washed away. While storms may have played a role in worsening conditions, this theory alone does not explain the carvings or the apparent orderly dismantling of the settlement. Though less historically grounded, supernatural explanations have become part of the folklore surrounding Roanoke. Some legends claim that the colonists fell victim to witchcraft, curses, or even vanished into another dimension. The word, CROATOAN, has since been linked to strange disappearances in other contexts, such as in the writings of Edgar Allan Poe and in American popular culture. While entertaining, these theories are symbolic rather than factual. They reflect the colony's status as a haunting mystery but don't hold historical weight. The reason none of these theories fully resolves the mystery is that the evidence is fragmentary. Archaeological digs have produced intriguing artifacts but not enough to prove definitive survival or assimilation. Written accounts from neighboring tribes and later settlers contain tantalizing hints but also conflicting details. Most likely, the truth involves a combination of factors. Famine forced the colonists to leave, some joined the CROATOANs, others attempted inland migration, and smaller groups may have perished from disease or conflict. Over time, their traces scattered too widely to leave a single clear answer. In the end, the Lost Colony remains unsolved because every theory has gaps. The colonists may not have been truly lost, in the sense of vanishing without a trace. They may have simply blended into the landscape of Native America. But because white never reached CROATOAN Island and no one pursued the lead seriously afterward, the chance for certainty slipped away.